Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 6 of the daily edition. In this column, the writer evaluates one of the key drawbacks of the national education policy that was recently introduced to replace the 1986 national education policy. The writer is of the opinion that the new education policy does not recognize that in India we have three different systems of education, and instead of trying to reconcile them, it tries to enforce a uniform national system of education. See, according to the writer, the three systems of education in the country are the central system, the state system, and the private system. The central system of education that the writer is referring to largely falls under the purview of the central government. Here you have a central board such as the CBSE, which primarily caters to elite English medium schools, predominantly in urban and semi-urban areas. Then under the central system, you also have institutions such as the Kendriya Vidyalaya, Navodaya, and other centralized educational institutions that are primarily run by the central government in order to cater to the needs of elite civil servants and government workers. Then you have the state system of education that falls under the respective state boards, where a higher preference is given for local languages. Then one should also remember that in a country of India's diversity, in each state, that is in each province, there will be a number of local variations, and these localized factors that are unique to each state and each society influences the kind of education that is provided by the respective states. Then you have the private system of education, which has become extremely popular of late, especially in Indian cities. And these private education institutions, they come with global affiliation, and they are accredited as per global standards, and they cater to a very elite niche segment in the urban areas. So this being the different systems of education that exist in the country, the writer argues that the national education policy of 2020 fails to recognize them and reconcile the differences between them. Instead, it blindly pushes for a centralized version of uniform architecture, and it provides for a one-size-fits-all solution at the national level by not taking into account the local variations that are seen at the state level. See, historically, education has always evolved at the state or provincial level based on local factors, and this has been especially true since the colonial times. During colonial rule, states and provinces were allowed to evolve their own education system based on local variations, and this has allowed state level education to be confined to a world of their own. Even though such a confined education model has its own drawbacks, it does provide a number of advantages, because at the end of the day, education is supposed to fulfill a social role and a social responsibility. Today, state education models, their policies and their syllabus seems outdated, and they seem to stuck in a world of their own, but it does provide for better learning outcomes. This is primarily because education at the state level is largely based on local factors, and this explains why a number of state governments have still stuck on to the recommendations of the Kothari Commission of the 1960s. Then more importantly, state-based education system was able to take into account local deprivation, that is caste-based deprivation, economic deprivation, etc., and suitably provide for social justice in the form of reservation, subsidies, etc. So it was in recognition of this primacy of states in leading education that the constitution makers placed the subject of education on the state list of the 7th schedule of the Indian Constitution. Then, in order to bring in coordination between regional education systems, nearly a century ago, the Central Advisory Board of Education was set up, which was supposed to act as an advisory body and help promote coordination between regional education systems. So during the colonial times, this was the extent of central intervention, wherein the task of the Central Advisory Board of Education was only to advise the state systems and help promote coordination between them, whereas the state education system was taking the lead role in drafting education policies based on local factors and local societal needs. So that's the reason why the Constitution considered states to be the appropriate sphere for dealing with education. So accordingly, the Constitution placed the subject of education on the state list of the 7th schedule. And post-independence, the advisory nature of the center continued until 1976. And there was a major shift in the center-state equation which was brought about by the 42nd Amendment Act. The 42nd Amendment Act, which was introduced during the emergency period, is also referred to as a mini constitution because of the number of controversial provisions that it introduced. One of the constitutional amendments introduced by the 42nd Amendment was the shifting of education from the state list to the concurrent list. So from then onwards, it gave the center greater powers to play a decisive role in determining education policies, and since then, the center has always tried to enforce its uniform national architecture on the state. The writer says that the same approach was seen in the National Education Policy of 1986, and the same has been reflected in the National Education Policy brought out in 2020 as well. According to the writer, the problem with the central system of education is that it caters to a very small segment and it does not take into account local variations and local factors. The CBSE Board of Education is limited to a few English medium schools, especially in cities, and to central government schools such as Kendriya Vidyalaya, Navodaya, etc., which primarily cater to civil servants and other government workers. So since the subject of education was shifted from the state list to the concurrent list, we started witnessing the parallel evolution of two systems of education, one under the center and the other under the states. The next major disruption in the field of education came during the LPG era, that is during the era of liberalization, privatization and globalization. So in the 1990s, as India liberalized itself and opened up for private investments and globalization, even the education sector took a turn towards private investment. As private schools started flourishing around the country, they became the preferred options for the urban elite, that is the middle class and the upper class in the urban areas. Over the last 2 to 3 decades, the private system of education has flourished rapidly, marked with a simultaneous decline of the state education system, accompanied with increasing centralization, wherein central policies are being enforced on state education systems. But however, central laws and policies in education are not entirely bad either. Take for example, how the Right to Education Act of 2009 provided for social justice by providing for reservation for weaker sections in private education. So central laws and policies can definitely help in promoting a uniform system and a nationalized system while taking care of the needs of social justice as well. But however, when a uniform system is enforced upon the states without taking regional variations into account, then it might make the education system a little less inclusive and a little less equitable. Because under such a centralized education system, students especially from the rural areas and semi-urban areas who primarily study in their vernacular languages might be at a disadvantage as compared to urban educated English-speaking students who would have primarily studied either under the central system of education or under private institutions. The writer argues that these differences creates a social inequality and prevents education from fulfilling its social role. The writer cites the example of the NEET entrance examination and how its attempt to enforce a uniform examination on students across the country is particularly affecting rural students who would have studied in state government schools. It is to address this discrepancy, state governments such as Tamil Nadu have provided for a separate quota to provide social justice to students who have studied in state government institutions. But the writer's concern is that the National Education Policy of 2020 takes away this discretion of the state governments, and instead it provides for a monolithic regulatory architecture that fails to identify the three systems of education in the country and fails to recognize the pros and cons of each education system. And hence, according to the writer, the National Education Policy is not in a position to reconcile the differences between the three systems of education. Now let's take up a column from page number 7, which evaluates the failure of the RBI to contain inflation within the range that has been prescribed by the government. See, over the last 3 quarters, CPI inflation in the country has consistently persisted above the 6% levels. It was at 6.7% for the January to March quarter, 6.6% for the April to June quarter, and 6.9% in the July to September quarter. This level of inflation is clearly out of range because in 2016, the government had mandated the RBI to target an inflation of 4% with a range of plus or minus 2%, that is between 2% to 6%, and clearly the CPI inflation data for the last 3 quarters shows that RBI has consistently missed its target that was prescribed by the government. See, the central bank, that is the Reserve Bank of India, has been given the responsibility to manage the monetary policy of the country. Monetary policy is nothing but the control and regulation of money supply in the market through various monetary policy tools such as repo rate, reverse repo, etc. And by managing this money supply in the market, RBI tries to strike a balance between the conflicting objectives of controlling inflation and promoting economic growth. But since controlling inflation and promoting growth are conflicting objectives, it always placed the RBI at a direct standoff with the Government of India. Because the priority for the Ministry of Finance is always to promote economic growth while maintaining inflation at manageable levels. But generally, RBI's excessive focus on inflation control led the government to a standoff with the RBI, leading to questions over its monetary policy. This conflict pushed the government to interfere in the monetary policy decision making of the RBI, thereby raising questions over the transparency of monetary policy, and it highlighted the repeated failure of the government and the RBI to resolve their disputes and controversies. Because the RBI is supposed to be an autonomous institution, and the government was always accused of directly interfering with its autonomy. So in order to resolve this conflict and provide greater transparency to India's monetary policy, the RBI Act was amended by the government in 2016. Through this amendment, the Monetary Policy Committee was established, which has representation from both the government and as well as from the RBI. And this committee, headed by the RBI governor, was given the responsibility to manage the monetary policy of the country. Through the same amendment, the RBI was given an inflation target by the government of maintaining inflation at 4% with a range of plus or minus 2% in order to take into account any short-term exigencies. But however, the inflation data for the last 3 quarters clearly shows that the RBI has failed in its task because a consistent overshoot of the inflation range is inexcusable according to the author, and hence she wants the RBI to be held accountable for its failure. See, as per the amended RBI Act, the Reserve Bank of India is supposed to be held accountable by the government, and the RBI is supposed to submit a report highlighting the reasons for the failure of its monetary policy, and it should also outline the remedial actions that the RBI would be taking in the coming months in order to bring down inflation within the given target range. But unfortunately, this accountability exercise has not happened because the RBI has managed to escape government scrutiny by providing an excuse in its report. In its response to the government, the RBI has stated that the COVID-19 lockdown created difficulties in correct collection of data, that is the data related to prices at the ground level, especially at the retail level. And this, according to the RBI, has affected the computation of the inflation range. And the RBI has tried to label this as a break in inflation targeting because of the limitations created by the lack of data. But however, such excuses raises questions over the credibility, transparency and predictability of the functioning of the RBI and as well as the Monetary Policy Committee, and it also brings the country's monetary policy into question. The writer believes that there could be vested interests within the government and within the private industry who might be pushing the RBI to go easy on inflation targeting because high inflation numbers generally helps in painting a rosy picture of the economy. Because all the nominal data that is calculated, which does not take inflation into account, provides for much better numbers which might suit the interests of the government and the private industry. For example, the writer says that government's tax revenue and business revenue of an enterprise looks much better when nominal data is captured in a slightly high inflation environment. So it is in this context that the writer argues that RBI should be held accountable for its failure to control inflation within the legally prescribed range, and it needs to answer to the center and the public as to why its measures that are targeted at controlling inflation failed, and what corrective action would the central bank be taking in order to bring down inflation in the coming months. According to the writer, such accountability exercise alone can bring more transparency into the country's monetary policy and restore the faith and confidence of the public in the functioning of the central bank. Now let's take up a column from page number 7, which evaluates the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on nutrition levels among school children. See, over the last few months, we have repeatedly discussed how the pandemic has led to closure of schools around the world and how this has disrupted learning. But now we are going to understand how the long-term closure of schools as a result of the pandemic has been depriving millions of school children in India from accessing nutritious food. See, the midday meal scheme run by the state governments with the support of the center is one of the world's largest feeding program, and it not only provides for nutritious food to children and ensures adequate nutrition, but it also helps promote learning outcomes amongst children, and it also helps increase their enrollment ratio and retention ratio. Because when school children are well fed, their ability to concentrate in class naturally increases, thereby significantly improving learning outcomes. Then a guaranteed hot nutritious meal at school also encourages children and their parents to not only enroll their children in schools but also to retain them within the schooling system. So the ambitious midday meal scheme has single-handedly tackled the challenges of nutrition and learning among school children in India. But since the pandemic has led to the closure of schools for months together, it has completely disrupted the midday meal scheme, thereby denying school children access to nutritious food. According to a latest report brought out by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, around 369 million children around the world have lost access to nutritious food as a result of the pandemic and the closure of schools, and a majority of these children can be found in India. To further complicate things for India, the latest Global Hunger Index report shows that India's ranking is at a dismal 94th position out of 107 countries. This poor performance of India with regard to hunger and nutrition clearly shows that India is still way off the mark from achieving the zero hunger target by 2030, which is one of the sustainable development goals. It also shows that stunting, wasting, undernutrition and mortality amongst children is very high in India. So the midday meal scheme was helping India tackle these challenges of hunger and nutrition by providing a guaranteed nutritious meal to the children, which was filled with vital nutrients such as proteins and even micronutrients such as iron, vitamin A, folic acid, etc. But now that children are unable to go to schools, it has deprived them from accessing the nutritious fresh cooked meal through the midday meal scheme, and this disruption is having a disproportionate impact on children, especially from those who are from vulnerable communities. So the closure of schools and the disruption caused to midday meal scheme by the pandemic is likely to push a number of children out of the schooling system, and this could subsequently increase the problem of child labor. Because see, the pandemic on one hand has affected family income as well. As family incomes are coming down, and since children are all the time at home, since they have no schools to attend, they might be forced by the family members to take up jobs, thereby increasing the rate of child labor. This concern has been recently flagged in a report that has been brought out by the International Labour Organization and UNICEF. So even if schools reopen in a few months, a number of children may not come back to the schooling system because their families might have pushed them into child labor. So this is not just a short-term shock with regard to nutrition and learning amongst India's school children, but it might very well have a long-term impact on their nutrition levels and on their learning outcomes. So for the time being, the center had directed the state governments to at least provide dry rations to the school children, since the midday meal scheme is not functioning due to closure of schools. But however, states are struggling with regard to implementation, and data available from the Food Corporation of India shows that the offtake of food grains by states dedicated for the midday meal scheme has gone down substantially during the lockdown period. This is where the writers argue that we need innovation to ensure that adequate nutrition reaches children even during the pandemic. See, even as schools were forced to close down because of the lockdown and the pandemic, innovative methods were employed around the world to quickly switch to online learning in order to ensure that learning was not disrupted. So similarly, innovative methods and techniques are needed to ensure that nutrition is also not disrupted for school children. The writers suggest that the midday meal scheme could be linked with local producers, that is the small farmers in the local areas, and with local supply chains. Through such local sourcing, essential vegetables, fruits, eggs, and even cereal and milk can be sourced from the local farmers and producers, and this will not only help fulfill the dream of Atmanirbhar Poshan, that is nutritional self-sufficiency, but it will also help in improving the livelihoods in the rural areas. Next, on page number 10, The Hindu carries an interview with the Australian High Commissioner to India, who outlines the focus areas in the India-Australia relationship. First, he talks about the comprehensive strategic partnership that was forged between India and Australia during the virtual summit that was held between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Scott Morrison in June 2020. During a virtual summit between India and Australia, the two leaders established a comprehensive strategic partnership which has enabled India and Australia to take forward their defense and strategic relations, especially in the maritime security domain. As an extension of this, India has decided to include Australia as well under the Malabar naval exercises involving the other members of the Quad or the Quadrilateral, that is the United States and Japan. So the coming together of the navies of these four countries under a single joint exercise is expected to improve interoperability and is expected to promote defense cooperation between the four countries to deal with challenges facing the Indo-Pacific region, including disasters, that is natural disasters, by providing humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and also by jointly tackling the threat of piracy and terrorism in the region. The next focus area for India-Australia cooperation is the field of cybersecurity. India and Australia are looking to cooperate in the field of emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, quantum computing, 5G technology, etc. And in this context, it becomes very essential to jointly secure their cyberspace from any external threats. So for this purpose, India and Australia have signed a framework arrangement on cybersecurity and on developing cyber-enabled critical technologies. Under this program, Indian and Australian research institutions are going to develop critical cyber technologies in order to jointly enhance their cybersecurity through a 4-year program. Next, India and Australia are also looking to collaborate in the field of special minerals and rare earth metals. See, rare earth metals find a number of strategic applications, including in the field of defense, rockets, ballistic missiles, semiconductors, electronics, etc. Then you also need a variety of special minerals and metals to develop critical technologies such as electric vehicles, the lithium batteries that are needed to power them, etc. India, unfortunately, is resource deficient with regard to these special minerals and rare earth metals, and currently it is heavily dependent on China for importing them. Since Australia is blessed with these resources, India is looking to reduce its dependency on China and start sourcing these special minerals and rare earth metals from Australia, who is seen as a more reliable partner by India. Then Australia is also looking to support India's national quantum mission that is focused on research in the field of quantum computing. For this purpose, Indian and Australian research institutions are being funded through the Australia-India Strategic Research Fund that was established nearly 2 decades ago. Then Australia is also looking to become a key partner for India with regard to space technology as well. Space cooperation between India and Australia dates back to 1987, and since then, India has been sharing data collected from its remote sensing satellites with Australia to further promote research. Australia has even helped ISRO with regard to laser ranging for the Indian Regional Navigation Satellite System or NAVIC. Now, India-Australia are jointly exploring the possibility of establishing a ground station tracking facility for ISRO in Australia. This tracking facility is expected to come up to support India's Gaganyaan mission, which is slated to be India's first manned mission. Now let's take up the practice questions for today. Which of the following statements are correct? Remote sensing is the science of obtaining information about objects or areas from a distance, typically from aircrafts or satellites. Its applications include crop yield estimates, observation of chlorophyll levels, monitoring of phytoplankton blooms, preparation of cartographic maps, etc. Both the statements are correct. Option C is the right answer. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 4, the Odisha Space Application Center has proposed to make use of remote sensing data to identify the cultivation of prohibited drugs such as cannabis and hemp in real time by analyzing the remote sensing data using artificial intelligence algorithms. Now let's take up the next question. Red sanders or red sandalwood is endemic to the Eastern Ghats. Option B is the right answer. To be more specific, it is endemic to Andhra Pradesh in and around Tirupati and Chittoor districts, and it is a highly prized wood that is used for furniture and for other applications. So as a result, red sanders or red sandalwood is highly exploited and it is even smuggled illegally. And as a result of this overexploitation, it was listed as endangered by the IUCN until recently. But due to lack of sufficient data, the IUCN has placed red sanders under the near threatened category. Now let's take up the next question. Which of the following statements are incorrect? The Indian Penal Code was drafted on the recommendations of First Law Commission of India, established in 1834 under the Charter Act of 1833. It was under the chairmanship of Lord Thomas Macaulay. Both the statements are correct, so option D is the right answer, because the question is asking you to identify the incorrect statements. Let's take up the next question. The National Database on Sexual Offenders is maintained by NatGrid, National Crime Record Bureau, NIA, CBI. The correct answer is option B. See, these two questions were asked because we have an article on page number 10 that makes a reference to the Indian Penal Code, which is of colonial origin, and as well as to the National Database on Sexual Offenders. According to this article, the Union Ministry of Home Affairs has asked suggestions and feedback from the state governments in order to amend the IPC, which is outdated because of its colonial origin. Now let's take up the next question. What does Kessler syndrome refer to? A genetic disorder being reported in COVID-19 patients, the possibility of space debris generating a series of collisions that could threaten all space-based assets, a muscle degenerating disease caused by vitamin D deficiency, the rise of AI-driven super machines that could bypass human control. The correct answer is option B. Kessler syndrome refers to the theoretical possibility of a space debris triggering a domino collision or a cascading collision, which could pose a threat to all space-based assets. This question has been asked because on page number 11, we have an article which highlights the threat posed by space debris to all the satellites that are in orbit and as well as to future launches and space exploration. Let's take up the next question. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb is a terror outfit that is known to primarily operate out of which country? The correct answer is Algeria. Option D is the right answer. Please look at this map. It depicts the major terror groups that are operating in Africa. Some of them include the Al-Shabaab that operates out of Somalia, and you have Boko Haram that operates in Nigeria, and you also have AQIM, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, that primarily operates out of Nigeria and as well as in neighboring countries such as Morocco, Mali, Burkina Faso, etc. This terror group is in news because according to this article on page number 13, the AQIM has issued a threat to French President Emmanuel Macron over his recent controversial remarks on Islam and his defense of the cartoons that allegedly defamed Prophet Muhammad. Now for today, let's take up a practice question from the 2018 prelims paper. Which of the following led to the introduction of English education in India? The Charter Act of 1813, General Committee of Public Instruction, Orientalist and Anglicist controversy. All the three are correct. Option D is the right answer. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question, the National Education Policy of 2020 underestimates the problem of reconciling the three systems of education in India. Discuss. The second question, the RBI must be held accountable for its failure to control inflation. It must abide by the law and apprise the centre as to why it failed. Evaluate the statement. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.